The wind moved through the empty streets like it had nowhere else to go. Dust rolled across the wooden boards of the main road, slipping between cracks in old sidewalks, drifting past closed shutters and faded signs that hadn't been repainted in years. This was a town that had once had life miners, traders, laughter spilling out of saloons, but now it felt paused. Like the world had forgotten to press play again. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew the same rule here. Keep your head down, mind your business, and don't invite trouble. That was how you survived in Red Hollow. The sun was low that afternoon when the wagon appeared on the horizon. At first, it was just a shape against the heat, shimmer, slow moving, tired, almost reluctant to arrive. The horse pulling it was thin, its ribs faintly visible even from a distance. The wagon creaked with every turn of the wheels, as if it had been traveling far longer than it should have been able to endure. Inside sat a young woman and two small children. The woman held the reins tightly, though her hands trembled more from exhaustion than fear. Her dress was worn and faded, patched in places that told of long travel and harder days. Still, she kept her back straight, like she was trying to convince the world she still had strength left. The children leaned close to her, silent and wide-eyed. The younger one clutched a small cloth bundle, maybe all they had left in the world. As they entered Red Hollow, the town seemed to react without sound. Curtains shifted. Doors stayed closed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People looked, but only for a second, then looked away as if eye contact alone might bring consequences. The wagon rolled slowly down the main road. Not a single hand waved, not a single voice welcomed them, the woman noticed. She had seen cold stares before, but this was different. This wasn't just disinterest, it was avoidance, practiced and careful. Like everyone here had already agreed on something unspoken. She swallowed hard and kept moving. Near the general store, an old man sitting on a barrel turned his head slightly. His eyes followed the wagon, and for a brief moment something like sympathy flickered across his face. But then he lowered his gaze again, as if remembering something he shouldn't forget. The woman slowed the wagon. She hesitated. It was clear she was looking for help, or at least direction. Her lips parted as if she might ask a question, but no words came out. The silence of the town felt heavy enough to press against her chest. The children shifted nervously beside her. A boy standing near the water trough watched them pass. He looked no older than 12. His hands were frozen halfway to the bucket he had been filling. His expression showed curiosity and fear all tangled together. After a moment, his mother appeared behind him and quickly pulled him away without a word. That was how it worked here. Adults didn't explain things. They just prevented them. The wagon continued forward until it reached the center of town, where the road split in two directions. The woman finally pulled the reins, stopping the horse. For a moment, everything was still. Even the wind seemed to pause. She looked around slowly, left, right, then back toward the road she had come from. There was uncertainty in her eyes now. Not just about where to go, but whether she had made a mistake coming here at all. A door across the street creaked open. A man stepped out halfway, then stopped. He saw her looking and immediately froze. For a second, it seemed like he might speak, but then another voice called from inside the building behind him, and just like that, he stepped back in and closed the door, the sound of the latch clicking shut felt louder than it should have. The woman exhaled shakily. She lowered her gaze for a moment, as if gathering strength from somewhere deep inside herself. The children stayed close, watching her every movement. She didn't know it yet, but this town had already made its decision about her. And no one had said a single word, not yet. The wagon had barely stopped in the center of Red Hollow, but it already felt like it didn't belong there. The silence around it wasn't natural. It was the kind of silence that came from people choosing not to speak, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were afraid of what might happen if they did. The young woman sat still for a moment, gripping the reins tighter than necessary. Her knuckles were pale from fatigue and tension. She looked again at the buildings surrounding her, hoping to see a sign that she wasn't alone in the world. But Red Hollow gave nothing back. The storefront windows reflected her image faintly, distorted by dust and old glass. Behind those windows, shapes moved, people watching her without being seen clearly in return. It felt less like a town and more like an audience that refused to acknowledge the stage. The children shifted beside her. The older child, a girl of maybe 7 or 8, tugged lightly at her sleeve. "Ma, are we there?" she asked softly. The woman hesitated before answering. Her voice came out thin, as if she hadn't used it in days. I think so." But even as she said it, she didn't sound convinced. The younger child, a boy barely old enough to speak clearly, held a small bundle wrapped in cloth. It was all they had left, whatever could not be carried away from the life they had lost before reaching this town. He looked around with wide, confused eyes, sensing something was wrong but not understanding what. A dog barked somewhere down an alley. The sound was sharp, and then it stopped abruptly, as if even the animal had been told to be quiet. The woman swallowed hard. She needed help. That much was clear. The journey here had taken everything from her strength, her certainty, even her hope. The wagon creaked slightly as the horse shifted its weight, exhausted from travel. She scanned the street again. "Excuse me," she called out gently. Her voice carried through the empty space between buildings. No answer came. A man standing near the blacksmith shop tightened his grip on a hammer he wasn't using. He glanced at her, then quickly looked away. Another man beside him muttered something under his breath, too quiet to hear, but the message was obvious. "Don't get involved." The woman tried again, louder this time. "We're looking for shelter or work, anything we can do." The words hung in the air. Still nothing. A woman behind a lace curtain in the second-floor window of a boarding house watched carefully. Her hand was pressed against the glass, fingers tense. She seemed conflicted, like she wanted to open the window, but instead she stepped back and pulled the curtain shut. That small movement said everything. The young mother's shoulders dropped slightly. She wasn't just being ignored. She was being avoided on purpose. The older child noticed it too now. Her face tightened as she looked around nervously. "Why? Is nobody talking to us?" she whispered. The woman didn't answer immediately. She didn't know how to explain fear. She couldn't fully understand herself yet. Before she could respond, a voice finally broke the silence, but not from someone offering help. It came from a man standing outside the saloon at the far end of the street. "Best you keep moving," he called out flatly. No anger, no kindness. Just warning. The woman turned toward him quickly. "We just need a place to rest," she said. "We've traveled for days." "We have children," I said. "Move on," the man interrupted, not raising his voice but making it firm enough that it carried weight. A few nearby townsfolk shifted uncomfortably. No one disagreed with him. No one defended her either. The woman looked at the children again. The boy clung closer to her now. The girl's eyes had begun to fill with confusion and fear. For the first time, the woman realized something worse than being lost. She was not welcome here, not even a little. She tightened the reins again, unsure what to do next. The horse snorted softly, as if sensing the tension in the air. The wagon creaked as it stood still in the middle of Red Hollow, surrounded by people who could see them clearly, but had already decided they didn't exist. Red Hollow didn't feel like a town built on fear at first glance. To a stranger, it might have looked simply quiet, weathered buildings, slow streets, tired faces. But if you stayed long enough, you would realize something deeper was holding everything in place. Not law, not order. Something heavier, something unspoken. The wagon still stood in the center of the street. The young woman had not moved it yet. She didn't know where to go, and no one had given her a reason to choose any direction. The horse shifted its weight impatiently, but even the animal seemed to sense that this place was different. The children stayed close to her. The girl's eyes darted from face to face, trying to understand why no one helped. The boy had stopped asking questions entirely. He simply watched, as if learning a new rule about the world, one that didn't make sense but had to be accepted anyway. Around them, life in Red Hollow continued in a strange, careful rhythm. Man swept the porch of his store, but slower than necessary. Watching the wagon between strokes of the broom, another man nailed a loose board into a fence, but his hammering stopped whenever he thought the woman might look his way. Even the saloon doors barely swung anymore. The usual noise of laughter, music, and drunken voices was muted today, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Everyone was watching. No one was stepping forward. The young woman finally tried to speak again, but her voice had lost confidence. "Please," she said quietly, "we don't want trouble. We just need help for one night, that's all." Her words were honest, simple, human, but honesty didn't seem to matter here. A group of 3 men stood near the edge of the street outside a hardware store. They were dressed like ranch hands, dusty boots, and worn hats, but they didn't look like they had just finished working. They looked like they were waiting for something or someone. One of them tilted his head slightly. "Not smart," he muttered under his breath. The second man didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the wagon. The third finally spoke, low enough that only the others could hear. "She should have turned back before she got here." That sentence carried more weight than it should have. It wasn't advice. It was acceptance. Like her fate had already been decided before she ever arrived. The young woman noticed them looking. She straightened slightly, trying to regain some dignity. Even exhausted, even afraid, she refused to appear broken in front of strangers. "I can work," she said louder now. "I can cook, clean, anything. We just need—" A door slammed somewhere nearby. The sound cut her off instantly. Not a word followed it. A woman inside the general store quickly pulled her child away from the window. The child had been staring openly at the wagon, curious. But the mother's reaction was sharp, almost frightened. "Don't look at them," she whispered urgently. "Why?" the child asked. The mother hesitated. For a moment, it looked like she might answer truthfully. Instead, she simply said, "Because I said so." And that was how fear worked here. It didn't always need explanations. It only needed repetition. The wagon's wheels creaked as the horse shifted again. The sound seemed loud in the silence. The young woman looked around once more, slower this time. Her hope was fading, replaced by something more difficult, confusion mixed with disappointment. She had expected rejection, maybe, but not this collective refusal to even acknowledge her. A man sitting on a barrel near the livery stable spat into the dirt. He didn't look at her, but he spoke anyway. "You're wasting time," he said flatly. The woman turned toward him. "Then tell me where to go," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "If this isn't the place, just tell me where we can go." The man paused. For the first time, his expression changed slightly. Not compassion exactly, but discomfort. Like she had asked a question he wasn't supposed to hear. He looked over his shoulder toward the street, as if checking whether anyone was listening. Then he shook his head. "I can't help you," he said. Not. Won't. Can't. That distinction meant something here. The woman stared at him for a long moment, trying to understand what kind of place refused help even when it admitted it could not give it. Around them, the town remained still. No one moved closer. No one stepped forward. But everyone watched. And in that watching, something became clear. Red Hollow wasn't just afraid of outsiders. It was afraid of what might happen if someone finally decided not to be afraid anymore. The sun had shifted lower now, casting long shadows across Red Hollow's main street. The heat of the day was fading, but the tension in the air had only grown heavier. It clung to everything: walls, windows, even the dust itself. And then from the far end of the road came the sound of hooves, slow, steady, unhurried. At first, no one paid attention. Or maybe they pretended not to. But as the rider came closer, people began to notice. A lone cowboy on horseback. He wasn't dressed like a man passing through for comfort or trade. His clothes were worn from travel dust-covered boots, a faded coat, a hat that had seen too many storms. The horse beneath him was strong but tired in the way only long miles can create. He didn't rush. He didn't look uncertain. He simply rode into Red Hollow like he belonged to no one and answered to nothing. The wagon in the center of town was the first thing he saw. It was impossible to miss. The woman, the children, the stillness around them, it all formed a picture that didn't need explanation. Even from a distance, something about it felt wrong. He slowed his horse slightly. Not because he was afraid, because he was observing. His eyes moved across the street carefully, noticing the way people stood too still, the way conversations stopped mid-word, the way hands hovered near belts or door frames but never moved forward. This wasn't normal quiet. This was controlled quiet. The cowboy finally reached the edge of the main street and stopped his horse. The animal exhaled softly, shifting its weight. Dust settled around its hooves. He remained still for a moment, taking in everything. The woman in the wagon noticed him. At first, she thought he might just be passing through like everyone else. Another man who would see them and look away. Her hope didn't rise. She had already learned not to expect it. But he didn't pass. He stopped. Their eyes met briefly. And something subtle changed in the air. The cowboy's gaze didn't slide. Away like the others, it held steady, not aggressive. Not judgmental, just aware, fully aware. The children noticed him too. The little boy leaned slightly forward, studying the horse, the man, the strange calmness he carried. The girl stayed close to her mother, but her eyes followed the rider with quiet curiosity. The cowboy shifted slightly in his saddle. His hand rested loosely near the reins, not ready for a fight, but not careless either. He looked toward the center of town again. The wagon, the silence, the people pretending not to watch him now. Then he spoke not loudly, but clearly enough for nearby ears to catch. "What's going on here?" The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but it landed heavily anyway. No one answered. A man near the saloon adjusted his hat and looked away. Another stepped backward slightly, as if distance could remove responsibility. The cowboy's eyes narrowed just slightly. He wasn't just seeing a family in trouble. He was seeing a town that had already made a decision and was now refusing to admit it. The woman in the wagon tried to speak again, cautiously. We just need help," she said, her voice quieter now. "We didn't mean to cause trouble." The cowboy turned his attention fully to her. Not the crowd, not the buildings. Her. That simple shift changed everything. For the first time since she arrived, someone was actually listening. "I asked a question," he said calmly, still not raising his voice. "And I expect an answer." The tension in the street tightened instantly. A few men shifted uneasily. One of them, the same group from earlier, exchanged a glance. Their posture changed slightly, not aggressive yet, but alert. The cowboy noticed. He noticed everything. The woman swallowed hard, then spoke more clearly. "We've been turned away everywhere," she said. "No one will tell us where to go." A pause followed. The cowboy looked around the town again. The silence felt different now. Not just fear but resistance to truth being spoken aloud. He understood enough. Slowly he dismounted. His boots hit the ground with a soft thud. Dust rose around him. He took one step forward toward the wagon. And for the first time since, Red Hollow had been built. Someone was about to stand in the middle of its silence and refuse to walk away from it. The street in Red Hollow felt tighter now, as if the buildings had leaned in to listen. The cowboy stood a few steps from his horse, still as the dust settled around his boots. Nothing about his posture was rushed or dramatic. Yet the way he stood made the entire street feel different, less like a place where people ignored problems, and more like a place where problems could no longer hide. The wagon creaked softly behind him. The young woman watched carefully, unsure of what was happening. She had seen men pass through towns before, some kind most indifferent. But this man felt different. Not because he looked powerful, but because he didn't seem willing to pretend nothing was wrong. The children stayed. Close to her. The boy peeked out from behind the wagon's wooden side. The girl held on to her mother's sleeve tighter than before. The cowboy finally turned his attention fully toward the woman again. "You said you've been turned away everywhere?" He said calmly. Double quotes. "Yes," she answered quickly. "Every door we've knocked on. No one will even speak to us properly." His eyes shifted briefly toward the surrounding buildings again. He saw the subtle movements, the man stepping back into a doorway, the curtain closing too fast, the group of men pretending to study the ground. A town full of witnesses. No one willing to be responsible. The cowboy exhaled slowly, like he was weighing something heavier than the moment in front of him. Then he spoke again. Who told you to leave? The question wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence sharper than anything else had all day. The woman hesitated. Her gaze dropped for a moment. There was a man. Near the saloon, she said carefully. He said we should move on. The cowboy nodded once, as if confirming something he already suspected. He turned slightly toward the saloon at the end of the street. A few men near it shifted immediately. Not forward, not backward, just tense. One of them muttered under his breath. This isn't his business? But no one said it loud enough to challenge him directly. The cowboy heard it anyway. He always seemed to hear. What wasn't meant to be spoken. He took one step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, not threatening, but impossible to ignore. The space between him and the wagon closed until he was standing beside it, close enough now that the woman could see his face clearly. There was dust on his jawline and a tiredness in his eyes that didn't come from weakness but from having seen too much and still choosing to stand upright. He looked at the children, briefly, then back at the woman. You didn't do anything wrong coming here, he said quietly. The words landed differently than anything else she had heard all day. Not pity, not dismissal, just certainty. The woman blinked, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. Around them the town shifted. Uneasily, a chair scraped somewhere. A door creaked open a fraction, then stopped. Someone coughed, quickly covering it. The cowboy turned his head slightly toward the street again. This town has a habit, he said, loud enough now for others to hear, of watching things happen without stepping in. No one responded. Continued anyway, and I can see that same habit right now. A man near the hardware store stiffened. Another looked away. The cowboy wasn't accusing anyone directly, but he didn't need to. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. He turned back toward the wagon. I don't know what trouble followed you here, he said to the woman, but I know what I see. A pause. Then, more firmly, you and your children aren't staying out here in the open, not while I'm standing here. The words weren't loud, but they carried authority, not the authority of a badge or title, but of conviction. The woman's lips parted slightly. She seemed torn between relief and disbelief. I don't want to cause trouble, she said softly. The cowboy shook his head once. Trouble isn't caused by needing help, he replied. That line changed something in the air. Few townspeople shifted again. But this time it wasn't just fear. It was discomfort, because someone had said out loud what many of them had been avoiding thinking about. The cowboy finally turned slightly toward the crowd. Not aggressively, just enough to make sure they were all hearing him. If anyone has something to say, he said evenly, now's the time. Silence answered him. Long, heavy, unbroken. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. And in that moment, the decision had already been made, not by the town, but by the one man who refused to let silence decide for them. The silence after the cowboy's words stretched longer than anyone liked. Red Hollow had always been quiet when it mattered, but this quiet was different. It wasn't peace. It wasn't calm. It was tension held too tightly, like a rope pulled to its limit, waiting for the smallest pressure to snap it. The cowboy stood beside the wagon, his posture steady. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He wasn't making threats. Yet somehow that made him more unsettling to the town than if he had been shouting, because he wasn't acting like someone trying to win a fight. He was acting like someone refusing to allow one. The young woman watched him closely. For the first time since entering Red Hollow, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in dazed certainty, that she wasn't alone in the moment anymore. Still, fear lingered. Fear of what the town might do. Fear of what the silence might turn into. A few men near the saloon shifted again. One of them, broader than the others, stepped half a pace forward before stopping. His hand hovered near his belt, not fully aggressive, but clearly defensive. The cowboy noticed instantly. His eyes flicked toward the movement, not fast, not startled, just aware. He didn't turn fully toward the man yet. Instead, he spoke. Calmly, still facing the wagon. "I'm not here for trouble," he said. The words weren't soft, but they weren't sharp either. They were controlled, measured, like someone who understood exactly how far things could go if pushed. The man, near the saloon, scoffed under his breath. "That's what they all say," he muttered. The cowboy finally turned his head slightly in his direction. "Not enough to challenge? Enough to acknowledge?" "And yet," the cowboy replied evenly, "trouble seems to follow those who don't say anything at all." A few people nearby shifted, uncomfortably. The comment didn't accuse anyone directly, but it landed where it needed to. The saloon man straightened slightly. The air tightened again. The young woman instinctively pulled the children a little closer. She didn't understand the full history of whatever was happening, but she could feel the balance of it, like standing between two storms that hadn't decided whether to collide. The cowboy took one step forward, not toward the man, but toward the center of the street, positioning himself between the wagon and the crowd. It was subtle, but intentional. A line had been drawn without anyone announcing it. He spoke again, this time louder so all could hear. "This family asked for help," he said. "They didn't demand anything. They didn't threaten anyone. And yet they were turned away from every door in this town." No one responded. Woman behind a curtain briefly pulled it back an inch, then let it fall again. The cowboy continued. "I want to know why." The question hung there, simple, direct, unavoidable. A long pause followed. Then one of the men near the hardware store finally spoke up, but cautiously, like someone stepping onto thin ice. "They're not from here," he said. The cowboy turned his gaze toward him. "That's not an answer," he replied. Another man added quickly, "We don't get involved in other people's problems." The cowboy nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer. "And yet," he said, "you're all involved now." That statement hit harder than the others, because it was true. Whether they acted or not, they were already part of it. The woman in the wagon looked between the cowboy and the crowd. Her voice came out softer than before, but steadier. "We didn't want trouble," she repeated. "We just needed somewhere safe." The cowboy glanced at her briefly, then back at the town. "Safety isn't something you refuse to give and still call yourself a town," he said. A few people looked away at that, not out of anger, out of recognition. The cowboy slowly shifted his stance, not aggressive, but grounded-like. Someone prepared to hold his ground as long as necessary. "I'm going to say this once," he continued. His voice lowered slightly, but carried even more weight. "Either someone here steps forward and explains why this family is being turned away, or we stop pretending this is a place worth calling home." The words weren't a threat of violence, but they were a threat to comfort. And in Red Hollow, comfort had always depended on silence. The street remained still. No one moved. No one spoke. The cowboy waited. The wind moved through the town again, stirring dust along the boards. A shutter creaked somewhere. The horse shifted behind him. And in that moment, everyone understood. This wasn't about one family anymore. It was about whether anyone in Red Hollow was still willing to be human when it mattered. The silence after the cowboy's challenge didn't feel the same anymore. Before, silence in Red Hollow had been a shield, something people used to avoid responsibility. But now it felt exposed, fragile, like it might crack under the weight of what had just been said. The cowboy remained where he stood, still, patient, not pressing forward, not backing down. Just waiting in a way that made it clear he wasn't going to fill the silence for them anymore. The young woman in the wagon watched the town carefully. She had stopped expecting help hours ago. Now she was simply watching to see what kind of place she had arrived in, what kind of people could stand in front of someone in need and say nothing for so long. The children stayed close to her, quieter now, sensing that something important was happening even if they didn't understand. A man near the hardware store shifted his weight again. He looked at the cowboy, then at the ground, then toward the saloon. His jaw tightened as if he was fighting a decision inside himself. Finally, he spoke not loudly but clearly enough. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. That sentence changed the tone immediately. The cowboy's gaze moved to him. "Like what?" he asked simply. The man hesitated. A long pause followed. It was the first time someone in the town hadn't immediately hidden behind silence or excuses. "She came with them," the man said carefully, nodding slightly toward the wagon. "Weeks ago?" "That group. There was trouble when they passed through the valley." The woman stiffened slightly in the wagon. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly. The man lifted his hand slightly. "I'm not blaming you," he said. "I'm just saying, after that people got nervous." The cowboy studied him closely. "Nervous," he repeated. "And your response to nervousness was to turn away a mother and children?" The man didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. That silence meant more than words. Something shifted in the crowd. A woman standing outside the general store stepped forward half a step, then stopped. Her hand trembled slightly as she looked at the wagon. "They look scared," she said quietly. Heads turned toward her immediately, as if surprised someone had spoken. The woman continued, voice uneven but growing stronger. "I saw them when they first came in. I told my husband they looked like they needed help." Her husband beside her looked uncomfortable, but didn't interrupt. Another man near the saloon muttered, "That's not our problem." But this time it didn't land the same way, because now someone had already broken the pattern. The cowboys. Attention moved across the crowd slowly. One voice had become two, not rebellion yet, but awareness. The young woman in the wagon watched carefully, her breath slightly caught in her throat. She didn't dare hope fully, but something was shifting. The cowboy spoke again. Quieter now. "This is how it starts," he said. He didn't look at anyone in particular. "It doesn't take a gun or a fight. Just silence." Repeated long enough that people forget they ever had a choice. A few townspeople lowered their eyes. Not all of them agreed with him, but more than before, they were listening. The hardware store man finally spoke again, this time more firmly. "We didn't know what would happen if we helped," he said. "There's people in this town, people who don't like outsiders interfering." The cowboy nodded slightly, so fear made the decision. He said, No one corrected him. A long pause followed. Then something unexpected happened. Boy no older than 12 stepped out from behind a nearby fence post. He looked nervous immediately, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be there, but he spoke anyway. "My ma said we should have helped," he said quickly. "But my pa told us not to get involved." The boy looked down, then added softly, "I don't understand why that matters more than them." That small voice landed differently than all the others because it wasn't fear speaking. It was confusion. Honest confusion, and it made the adults uncomfortable in a way arguments hadn't. The cowboy looked at the boy for a moment, then nodded once. "You're asking the right question," he said quietly. That was when it started. Not a sudden change, not a dramatic reversal, but a slow breaking of something that had held the town together for too long. A man near the saloon stepped back instead of forward. A woman opened her door slightly and didn't close it immediately. Someone else exhaled, like they had been holding their breath for hours. The wagon remained still. The young woman didn't speak. She didn't have to, because for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, she wasn't being ignored completely, and in a place built on silence. Even the smallest sign of change felt like thunder beginning to roll in the distance. The air in Red Hollow felt different now, still heavy, still uncertain, but no longer completely closed off. Something had cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that people could no longer pretend nothing was happening. The cowboy stood where he had been since the confrontation began, his posture unchanged. He wasn't celebrating and he wasn't pushing further. He simply waited, as if the next step no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to the town. The young woman in the wagon looked around slowly. For hours, she had felt invisible. Now, she could feel eyes on her again, but not all of them carried the same weight as before. Some were still fearful. Some were uncertain, and a few, just a few, looked conflicted enough to suggest something inside them had shifted. The children stayed close to her, but even they seemed to notice the change. The boy relaxed his grip on the cloth bundle slightly. The girl blinked, watching a man across the street who was no longer pretending she didn't exist. The hardware store man exhaled slowly. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "There's an old shack behind the stable," he said. "It's not much, but it's dry." No one interrupted him. That alone was new. The cowboy turned his head slightly toward the stable. He didn't smile. He didn't nod in approval. He simply acknowledged the information as if it had always been the obvious answer waiting to be spoken. "Who owns it?" he asked. The man hesitated. "No one really," he said. "Haven't used it in a long time?" A pause. Then, carefully, he added, "It's not fit for much, but it's better than the street." The cowboy finally looked toward the wagon. His voice softened slightly when he spoke. "It's a start," he said. The woman swallowed, still uncertain. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "We don't want to be a burden." The cowboy shook his head once. "You already aren't," he said simply. That sentence carried more weight than anything else spoken that day. Few townspeople shifted again, but not out of resistance this time. Out of reflection. Slowly, one of the doors near the general store opened wider than before. A woman stepped out holding a small tin cup of water. She hesitated at first, then walked toward the wagon. Her movements were cautious but deliberate. She stopped a few steps away and extended the cup. "It's not much," she said softly. The young woman looked at her for a moment, almost as if she couldn't trust what she was seeing. Then she carefully accepted it. "Thank you," she whispered. That simple exchange did more than any argument could have. It was small, but it was real. The cowboy watched without moving, letting it happen naturally. Another man near the saloon scratched the back of his neck, uncomfortable. Then, after a moment, he walked toward the stable without speaking to anyone. He didn't look at the wagon directly, but he also didn't avoid it anymore. The pattern had changed, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to be noticed. The young woman finally climbed down from the wagon, helping her children carefully. Her legs trembled slightly when she landed on the ground, but she stayed upright. The cowboy stepped aside slightly to give them space. "You'll be all right there for tonight," he said. She looked at him, still processing everything. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. He adjusted his hat slightly, as if brushing off the importance of the question. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Just remember, this place is bigger than the fear it's been living in." The words weren't dramatic. But they stayed in the air long after he spoke them. The townspeople began moving, not all at once, and not all in the same direction, but movement had returned. Someone opened a door fully. Another called out quietly, offering blankets. A few stood watching, no longer hiding their interest or their guilt. The wagon was guided toward the stable area slowly, not by force, but by permission that hadn't existed before. As the woman and children followed, she glanced back one more time. The cowboy was already walking away, not leaving in triumph, not waiting for recognition. Just leaving the moment behind as if his part in it had always been temporary. Red Hollow didn't transform instantly, but as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the street, something undeniable remained. For the first time in a long while, someone had broken the silence. And the town had not fallen apart because of it. Instead, it had begun to wake up.